Okay, great. So thanks for having me. I'm just going to dive right in. This is a talk about positioning, and in my experience, positioning is not a new concept, but it is a really, really misunderstood concept. In fact, even amongst marketers, if I was to gather a room full of vice presidents of marketing and say, "Hey, define positioning," I'm likely to get a dozen different definitions. Um, Often, when I talk about positioning, it's so misunderstood that I have to actually start by talking about what positioning is not. So people will say, "Oh, yeah, I know what positioning is. It's the same thing as messaging," or "Yeah, positioning, it's just like a tagline, right?" And my personal pet peeve is when people talk about brand positioning, which drives me nuts because, in my opinion, there is branding and there is positioning, and these two things are actually completely separate. In fact, everything on this slide actually flows from positioning, but you have to have positioning first. You can think of it a bit like this: if everything we do in marketing and sales is the house, positioning is the foundation upon which the house is built. Now, if I talk to um, non-marketers, they want to have a definition. So here's my definition. It's not very good, I'll warn you. Positioning defines how our product is the best in the world at providing some value that a well-defined set of customers cares a lot about. It's a bit of a mouthful. That's because positioning is made up of a set of different components. We'll get to that in a minute. If I'm dealing with someone like the CEO of the company or somebody who's completely outside of this stuff, one good way to think about positioning is to think about it. It's a lot like context setting for products. Context is kind of how we make sense of things, particularly new things that we've never encountered before. You can think of it a bit like the opening scene of a movie. If you're in lockdown, which sucks, but someday you'll get back to the movies. But when you go to the movie theater, you sit down, the movie starts, and the job of the opening scene is to kind of answer your big questions, like, where are we? What time frame is this? What city are we in? Who are these people? How should I feel right now? And then once I get these big questions answered, then I can kind of settle in and pay attention to the details of the story. This is a shot from the opening scene of Apocalypse Now, which is widely regarded to be one of the best opening scenes ever. The opening scene of Apocalypse Now is actually genius at this. So it starts with this shot of the beach, and it's nice. There's palm trees, and maybe you're thinking, "Hey, it's not apocalypse right now. Maybe it's apocalypse a half an hour from now." But slowly the music gets a little bit more intense. We get this dust kicking up, and we realize it's smoke, and then helicopter goes by, and all of a sudden, boom, the beach is on fire, and oh my gosh, we're in the middle of the Vietnam War. It's terrible. And then the scene switches, and we get Martin Sheen in his hotel room, and we realize this is his memory. He's in a hotel room, and he's drinking, and he's smoking, and he's clearly in distress. He walks over to the window, he peeks out the blind, and we get the first line of dialogue in the movie where he looks out and he goes, "Saigon. Shit, I'm still only in Saigon. Every time I think I'm going to wake up back in the jungle." So here we are. We're 3 minutes into the movie, and we know a lot. Like we're in the middle of the Vietnam War. Specifically, we're in Saigon. Our lead character's been there before, and who it didn't go so well. He's got PTSD. This movie isn't going to be a laugh riot. It's going to be kind of intense. And now we can settle in and pay attention to the details of the story. Positioning works kind of the same way. And so when people encounter our product for the first time, they'll look for clues in the context of it to figure out what it's all about so that they can figure out whether or not they need to pay attention to it. One of the ways we set context for products is with market categories. Market categories are actually really important. It's a really important way for customers to figure out what they need to pay attention to and what they don't. So this is important because our markets are crowded. So I sometimes use this chart just to like freak people out about how crowded a market can be. If you think about all the software and all the land to solve any problem, this is one guy's attempt to model just one tiny corner of that universe, just the software to solve marketing problems. And look at that thing. It's a disaster. There's 8,000 companies on there. How could I ever figure out what to pay attention to and what not? Well, you can see this guy, he's kind of taken market categories as a way to help us make sense a little bit of these 8,000 companies. So he's got macro categories and micro categories. The macro ones are the colors, like red is advertising and promotion, and orange is content and experience. And then inside, there's these little islands of like individual market categories in there. So let's say I'm a head of marketing and I decide, you know what I need? I need live chat on my website. And so I look at this and I'm like, oh man, that's a lot of companies. I don't know, live chat. That kind of sounds like social and relationships, maybe. And oh, sure enough, in there, there's a box and it's called bots and live chat. And that's great. So now I don't have to pay attention to all 8,000 companies in this on that chart anymore. I've narrowed it down to just, well, I mean, to be honest, it still sucks. It's way too many, but at least it's not 8,000 anymore. But that's not all positioning your product in a particular market category does. It doesn't just narrow down the competition. What it does is it sets off a really powerful set of assumptions in the minds of customers about what your product is all about. It works a bit like this. If I were to walk up to you, let's say this is, I don't know if they have this in New Zealand. They have any of these pitch contest things like Shark Tank or Dragon's Den. You know, sometimes you see these shows where that startups come on and they pitch the investors and they say, hey, I got this thing. And the investors either say, yeah, that's great, or no, that's stupid, go away. Anyway, let's say we're doing one of those pitch contests, except in this case, all I get to tell you is my market category. So I walk in and I go, hey, I got this amazing thing. It's a revolutionary, next generation, never been seen before, fantastic CRM, customer relationship management. It's a CRM. That's what it is. Yep, that's all you get. Who's my competition? Salesforce, right? They're the leader in that market. They're widely known as the leading CRM out there. If I say you're in the CRM market, well, I just declared war on Mark Benioff. I'm competing against them. Okay, what features would you expect my CRM to have? Well, you would obviously track deals across a funnel, track accounts, CRM stuff. I would expect you to do that. What's the title of the person that I sell my CRM to? Well, that would be VP sales, head of sales, sales manager. That's who buys a CRM. Now, however, it gets crazy. Like, what does my CRM cost? Now, how would you know that? How would you know? I didn't tell you anything about my product. How would you know what the pricing is? But I declared that I was in the CRM market category. You assumed that I compete with Salesforce. Because they're the leader in that category. So I couldn't possibly charge more than the market leader, could I? Now, here's how this works. If I do a good job, I position my product in a market category, and that positioning sets off a set of assumptions in the minds of customers about what my product is all about. And if those assumptions are true, fantastic. I just saved marketing and sales a lot of effort. I don't have to tell you who my competition is. It's assumed. I don't have to list every single feature. Half of that stuff is table stakes. Unfortunately, it works the same if I do a lousy job of it. So if I do a bad job, I position my product in a market category, it sets off a set of assumptions about my product that are not true. Now I got my work cut out for me. Marketing and sales is going to have to work pretty hard undoing the damage that positioning has already done. Let me give you an example. I had an old boss call me up. I used to work for him, and now he's a VC and he works in Silicon Valley and he funds companies. And he says, oh, I just funded this company. I love them. They're so great. And part of the reason why I funded them is customers love them. I talk to the customers think they're great. But you know, they've got this problem when they first talk to customers, no one can figure out what the thing is. And so it takes them a long time to close a deal. Maybe that's a positioning problem. Can you help them? I'm like, yeah, maybe. Let's get them on the phone. So they get on the phone and I'm like, hey, what's your deal? And they're like, well, we're lawyers, ex-lawyers. And we built this thing, email for lawyers. And my first thought was email for lawyers. Who knew the lawyers needed their own email? But okay, email for lawyers, fine. And they're like, yeah. So they jump into the demo. They show me this thing and there's an inbox and the lawyers and the clients are kind of collaborating on stuff. And I'm like, hey, this looks pretty cool. And then I asked them, well, how's the calendar work on this thing? And the CEO says, oh, we don't have a calendar. And I'm like, what? Wait, how do you replace Gmail and Outlook if you don't have a calendar? And he says, we don't actually compete with Gmail and Outlook. And I'm like, what? Like, you're telling me the lawyers need 2 emails? How the heck does that work? And then I was like, okay, back up. Your investor says customers love you. Why do customers love you so much? And they said, well, actually, the big thing we've got is we got this feature. It's pretty innovative. We got a patent on it, actually. And what it is a super secure context-aware file sharing. So you got the lawyers, you got their clients, they're collaborating on contracts. And so this thing has got some AI, and it'll look at the contracts and the communication up until then. It'll figure out who needs to have access to those contracts, puts it in a super secure place, and it only gives access to the people that need to have access to it, and the other people can't get at it. That actually sounds pretty cool. I can see the lawyers getting pretty excited about that. But also, I don't think it's email. I wouldn't buy email to solve that problem. So what these folks have is actually a really innovative, cool product masquerading as kind of crappy email. Now, what I could have done is I could take that exact same product. I'm not going to touch features. I'm not going to touch the product at all. I'm going to take the product, I'm going to pick it up, and I'm going to reposition it in another market. So what if I took that same product and I said, you know what? It's not email for lawyers. It's team collaboration for lawyers. Oh, that's different. That's a whole different set of assumptions. So who's my competition now? Well, it's not Gmail anymore or Outlook. It's Slack or Microsoft Teams. What feature would I expect this thing to have? Well, I don't know, probably some cool collaboration thing for lawyers and their clients. And that's exactly what they've got. All of a sudden, this thing is much more understandable. There's a bunch of other fringe benefits here too. When they were positioned as email, everybody would assume they were free or pretty much free. We assume the pricing is really different when we call it team collaboration. We're used to paying for that stuff. In this case, they put the price way up and ended up selling more. It also kind of highlights this other problem we have. That example is that most of the time, we don't actually position our products deliberately. So, the founder wakes up in the morning and says, you know what sucks? Email sucks. I'm going to make better email. And then they put the thing out and they add features and they take features away. Meanwhile, the whole market is changing too. And suddenly you've got this thing that, yeah, I know you set out to build email, but maybe it's contextualized better in another way. But us inside the company, we're just like, it's email. What else could it be? We're email people making email here. I'll give you another example. There's a company I work with here in Canada. Company is founded by a couple of guys that have advanced degrees in mechatronics engineering. They're robot guys. When they finished school, they started a startup making robots. So they got these robots. Eventually, they came up with this robot you see on the right-hand side here. And what this thing does is it drives around a manufacturing plant and it delivers things from one place to the other. Now, if you're not big on robotics, that might sound like an easy problem to solve. But in fact, this thing's a miracle of modern technology. It's full of mapping and sensors and artificial intelligence. It's amazing. So they go about trying to sell it to the folks inside a manufacturing plant that buy robots, and they get a meeting and they walk in there and they say, hey, we're ClearPath Robotics. We're here to sell you some fancy new robots. And the folks that buy robots in the manufacturing plant, they're like, robots. Yeah, robots, man. We've been buying robots for decades, in fact. And in fact, so long that we have approved robot vendors. You're not one of them. We're pretty sure our vendors can do something like this. I don't know. And why is your thing so expensive? Like, that's not what we're used to paying for robots, and a list of other questions. And the ClearPath guys are like, no, you don't understand. We're special robots, special robots unlike you've ever seen before. Eventually, they get this idea, you know what? Positioning this as a robot maybe isn't doing us any favors. So they take a step back and they're like, okay, what's special and different about us? Well, first of all, it's mobility. The thing drives around. It's mapping, it's sensors, it's artificial intelligence. What context could we weave around this product that all of that stuff would make sense to customers and we would be clearly differentiated from a generic run-of-the-mill robot. And eventually they came on this idea that, maybe what we've invented here is a self-driving car, or specifically autonomous vehicles for industrial uses. So they reposition the product, then they go in and have that conversation with the customer, and it's a completely different starting point. Of course it drives around. Of course it's full of mapping and sensors and artificial intelligence. Of course I don't get it from the same vendor that sells me a thing that picks up a roll of tape and puts it in a box. What I like about this example is you can see how the positioning filtered all the way through to the industrial design of the product. It's, they changed the name of it to Auto, and the product itself has white headlights on the front and red tail lights on the back. It's a robot. It doesn't need any lights at all. Those are literally just there to drive home this idea that this thing is a vehicle. Desk positioning, if we think it's important, we should know how to do it, right? So how do we actually get it done? So this is a question that vexed me for a long time. So my background is I did not go to school for marketing. I actually studied engineering in university. But when I graduated, I kind of fell into a job at a startup as a product marketer. One of the first projects I took on was we had a product that we thought was desktop productivity software. We ended up repositioning it as an embeddable database for mobile devices, pretty different positioning. And the thing took off and sold like crazy. We ended up getting acquired by a big company in Silicon Valley. My boss quit shortly after the acquisition. They put me in charge of marketing. I have no idea why, because I didn't know anything. And then I inherited 3 or 4 other products. They also needed to get repositioned. And I realized when we did that repositioning, we kind of didn't know what we were doing. We were just making it up. So I thought, this seems like a fundamental marketing thing to know. I should probably figure out how to do this. So I read a bunch of books. And I took a bunch of classes. And in fact, I took a post-grad thing at a fancy marketing school in the United States called Northwestern University. And so I took that class. And in that class that I took, there was a module on positioning. And so I'm like all excited. Okay, I'm going to finally figure out how it is we actually supposed to do positioning. And so I go to class that day. And the professor puts this thing up here. It's called the positioning statement. Maybe some of you have used one of this before, but the positioning statement is, in my opinion, maybe the dumbest thing I've learned about marketing ever. It's literally stupid. So here's how it is. It's like Mad Libs, and it's a fill in the blanks exercise where you say, my product is a blank that does blank, unlike blank, and delivers blank. And those blanks are things like my target market, the market category, my competitor, the value I deliver. So the professor's up there explaining this thing, and I'm sitting at the back going, okay, but how do I figure out what goes in the blanks? And then he just finishes up and moves on to the next lesson. And I'm like, whoa, hold up. And so I put up my hand and I'm like, wait, there's a blank there that says market category. Like I literally just repositioned a thing that we thought it was desktop productivity software, and that didn't work at all. And then we repositioned it as an embeddable database for mobile devices. And it turned out that was way better. So if I believe that most products can be positioned in multiple different market categories, how do I know what the right one is to write in this blank? And you know what the guy said to me? He give me this whole professor thing. He's like, who said that? I'm at the back. Me, I said that, and he's got his glasses on, and he looked down his glasses at me. And I said, how do you know? How do you know what the right one is? And he says, trust me, April, you'll just know. So, that's what really smart people say when they don't have a clue. And so at that point I was like, oh man, there is no accepted methodology to do this. That sucks. But part of what I got thinking of was at that point I had repositioned 3 or 4 products, and I thought, well, maybe, I don't know, maybe I can figure out. And so how would you figure out if you wanted to do this properly instead of just this thing? And so here's how I logicked it out to myself. So step one, maybe this is because I have an engineering background. I thought we'll solve this like we solve engineering problems. We will break the problem up into its component pieces, solve for the component pieces, smash it all back together, and voila, good positioning. So splitting it up into component pieces, turns out that's not a hard thing to do. Because we kind of agree what the component pieces are. They're more or less the blanks in the positioning statement. So what we really have is 5 things. So the first one is competitive alternatives. If you didn't exist, what would the customer do? Second one is unique features or attributes or capabilities. So, what do you got that the competition doesn't have? Next one is value, and specifically differentiated value. So, what can you do for customers? The next one is customer segmentation. So you're not trying to sell to everybody. You're just trying to sell to certain customers. So who are those customers? How do you define that? And then the last one is market category. Are you a robot or a self-driving car? What are you? And so those are the 5 components. So I thought, okay, we just figure out the best answer for each of those, put it together, and then we have positioning. But hey, the minute you start looking at that, the first thing you realize is that each of these component pieces actually has a relationship to the others. That's part of what makes this tricky. So let's take value, differentiated value. The differentiated value that my product enables for customers is completely dependent on what? It's dependent on my unique features or attributes, right? It doesn't come from anywhere else. That's where it comes from. So I can't figure out one without figuring out the other. But then I start thinking, well, yeah, but my unique features are only unique when I compare them to a competitor. So those 3 things are actually related. This is something the positioning statement never warned me about. So those things are all, I can't figure out one without looking at the others. And then customer segmentation, it's the same thing. My best fit customers are the customers that actually really, really care a lot about the value that I can deliver. So those things are tied together. And then I got market category. Well, this is a little more esoteric, but really, conceptually, your best market category, if we think about market category like context, it's the context that I position my product in such that the value that it delivers is kind of obvious to the customers that you're trying to communicate that to. So everything relates to everything else. Where do you start? and the conclusion I came to at this point was you can't start anywhere. It's actually a circle. So if we're going to solve this, it's a bit like a spiral. We'll pick a spot. We'll work our way around the wheel. We'll get candidate positioning. We'll take it out to the market. We'll test it. If it works, great. We'll run with it. If it doesn't, we throw it out. We work our way around the wheel again, get another candidate, and we'll test that. This works very well if you get it right the first time. So you get it right the first time, everyone's happy, away you go, you run. You get it wrong the first time, and you maybe are going to get fired because it takes you a long time to actually test it. And especially if you're selling something B2B and the sales cycles are long, and testing this thing's not easy. So if we didn't get it right the first try, then generally the executive team would start losing confidence in me and my ability to do anything, and that seemed a bit risky. And so this was not ideal, let's put it this way. But I struggled along with it for 2 years. And then finally, how I got out of this mess is a bit of a long story, but the short version of it is I discovered Clayton Christensen. And I spent about a year reading about jobs to be done and thinking about jobs to be done and thinking about how does jobs to be done actually relate to this positioning stuff. And the long story short, I had a bit of an epiphany, and the epiphany went like this. I actually have to start with competitive alternatives. If I don't start with competitive alternatives, what I end up with is positioning that sounds good in the office. It doesn't actually work when we take it out in the real world because it is not sufficiently differentiated from the other choices that my customers have. So here's how it goes. You start with competitive alternatives. If you didn't exist, what would the customer be doing? And then once I've got that, that's like a stake in the ground that says, this is what I got to beat in order to win a deal. And then we can say, all right, well, what have we got that they don't have capability wise, feature functions? What have we got that they don't have? We can make a big list of those. And then we can go down that list. And for each one of those things, we can say, so what? Why does a customer care? And that's going to get us to value. Once I have differentiated value, then I can ask myself the question, well, look, I could sell this thing to anybody that needs a product kind of like this, but some customers care a lot more about my differentiated value than others. And so what is it about those target accounts that make them really care a lot about it? So that's how I'm going to get to best fit customers. And then once I have that, I can start thinking about market category and say, okay, like, I can position this thing in a lot of different categories, but what category would actually be the best context to make this value obvious to these folks? So it actually has to build like this. Now, there's a lot of ways you can screw this up. And the most common way is step one, where you don't really consider competitive alternatives from the point of view of a customer. So I get a lot of companies come to me, particularly little startups, and they'll say, oh, we got this thing. It's really amazing. And I'll say, who do you compete with? And they'll give me this big, long list of dinky little companies in Silicon Valley nobody's ever heard of, like big, long list. Oh, all these folks. And then I'll say, well, how are you better than them? And they'll say, oh, our differentiated value is ease of use. That's it, man. Like if you look at this other competitor, it takes 59 clicks to do a thing, but if you go to ours, it only takes 3. So we're super easy to use, and that's why you would pick us. And then I'd say, I haven't actually heard of any of these companies. Do you actually lose a deal to them? And they'll say, no, we actually lose deals mainly to no decision. And I'm like, well, what's no decision? They still got the problem. Like, how are they solving the problem? And they'll say, well, with a spreadsheet. Or they'd hire an intern to do it. So what that really means is you're competing with a spreadsheet and the intern, and you didn't position well enough against either of those things. And you know what? If ease of use is your differentiated value, you know how you're not going to beat the intern on ease of use. Like the intern's really easy to use. The intern's like, hey, Joey, get me a coffee, fill out the spreadsheet, come on back when you're done. Super easy to use. But you know what? The intern sucks at all kinds of things. Like the intern makes mistakes. The intern quits on you. The intern doesn't understand the profile of a customer. Like there's all kinds of things software can do that the intern can't. So the first step on this is really important. You need to understand competitive alternatives from the perspective of a customer, not from the perspective of you inside the company or a potential investor. There's other things you can do to screw this up, but if you want to go way down the rat hole on positioning, everything I know is in this book. I'm going to give you one story at the end. I always tell this story, so if you ever heard me talk before, you heard this one, but I don't care. It's a good story, so I'm still going to tell it. And I think it's a good example of what happens when you go part way down that process, but you don't go all the way. So this was years and years ago when I was quite junior. I was working at a company that positioned itself in the enterprise CRM space. At that point, Salesforce was just was a smaller company, and Salesforce, people forget this, they were only focused on really micro SMBs, like people with like under 10 sales reps in a sales team. At the time, enterprise CRM was completely dominated by a big company in the Valley called Siebel. So we were positioned as enterprise CRM as well. So unsurprisingly, every time we got a meeting with a prospect, we'd say, we're enterprise CRM. And they'd say, oh, that's great. How are you better than Siebel? And the answer was, we just kind of weren't, man. Like in any way, they were a very mature product, way more features than us. They had 8,000 employees. I was like employee 21 or something, I think. They were doing 2 billion revenue. We were doing a little over 1 million revenue. They had 400 customers. We had 4 or 5. But anyway, but we did have, step one, who's the competitive alternative? In this case, it was Siebel. Step two, what do we got that they don't have? Well, it turned out we really only had one thing, which was we had this feature and it was cool. And you could model a relationship differently than you could in any other CRM at the time. The problem was is we never asked ourselves, how does that translate to value? Like we never asked ourselves the so what question. So what we do is we get into a meeting with these companies and we'd say, well, we got this feature, and we'd show it. It looked great in a demo. We say, here's the feature. And customers would go, hey, that looks kind of cool. What do you do with that? And we'd be like, anything you want. And then they would look confused. And then we'd hit them with our other differentiator, which was absolute desperation to close a deal. And so we would drop the price as low as needed to try to secure some business. At one point, I had a customer actually refer to us as the cheap, crappy Siebel, which, trust me, that's not a positioning you kind of want to hang your hat on. Anyway, so needless to say, things aren't going so good. How we got ourselves out of this was we hired a new sales rep. And so we weren't selling very much. So the sales reps tended to quit on us or we'd fire them. And then we'd have to hire new ones. So we had a sales rep come to do an interview. And the reason we hired him was in the interview, my CEO asked, why should we hire you? And the sales rep said, well, you should hire me because my buddy is the head of investment banking at Goldman Sachs and I'll get you a meeting. And we were like, sounds good, you're hired. So we hired the guy. And then he got us the meeting with the head of investment banking at Goldman Sachs. And I tagged along because I wanted to see what the office of the head of investment banking at Goldman Sachs looked like. And it was very impressive. It had a helicopter pad outside. It was cool. Anyways, we went there. We do the pitch. My sales rep's very good. He gets to the point where he pitches our magical feature. And the head of investment bank gets very excited. He starts asking us a lot of questions like, hey, if people sit on a board together, but they work at different companies, you could model that. And we're like, yeah. And he's like, hey, if they belong to the same golf club, you could model that. We're like, yeah. He gets really excited. He runs down the hall. He comes back with a couple of vice presidents. He's like, show him the thing, show him the thing. And we show him the feature again. Everybody gets really excited, close the deal on the spot. Amazing. This has never happened to us before. We get excited. We're like, hey, maybe investor bankers like our stuff. So we managed to get a meeting with Merrill Lynch. Same thing happens. We go in, head of investment bank gets really excited. It turns out the value of this feature is actually really, really important in the sales structure if you're doing a really deep relationship sell, which is what these folks are doing. Things are starting to look good at the company. Revenue's going up. More importantly, it triggered a conversation inside the office about what are we? Like, are we actually enterprise CRM? Or maybe are we just CRM for investment banks? Now, the reason we liked that positioning is because we thought, hey, if we position ourselves as CRM for investment banks, one, it would show that we're clearly different from Siebel. Two, maybe the investment banks would call us instead of us having to try to get meetings with investment banks. It would clearly show what we were. You know who didn't like that? The board. The board didn't like it. The investors were like, investment banking, oh my God, that's too small. And how many investment banks are there? How many deals are you going to do? Oh my God, we'll never make money if you do that. And so here's how we sold them on it. We said, look, positioning is not carved in stone. We don't just set it and forget it. So here's how it's going to work. We're going to be CRM for investment banks. When we dominate that market, then we're going to start branching out to retail banking because that'll give us permission to go there. And then we'll just be CRM for banking. Once we dominate that, then that's going to give us permission to get into insurance. And then we're going to be CRM for financial services. And hey, at that point, we're a pretty big company. We might be in a position to actually take Siebel head on, and then we'll be CRM for enterprise. And that's how we're going to get there and kill those guys. Board agreed, and we did the repositioning, and it changed absolutely everything about our business. The biggest change was we never went head to head against Siebel again. So we would go into a meeting, and instead of saying we're enterprise CRM, we'd go into the meeting and say, hi, we're CRM for investment banks. And the bankers would be like, don't you compete with Siebel? And we'd say, oh, Siebel. We love those guys. They're amazing. What amazing company. So much revenue, so many customers. In fact, they're probably the world's best general purpose CRM for, like, I don't know, call centers or manufacturing plants or retailers or something. Not you, Wolf of Wall Street. You need something special. Let me show you this thing. And then we closed the business. We went from a little over $1 million revenue to a little under 80 million revenue in about 18 months. And then the end of the story is that, Siebel got sick of us kicking their tail all around financial services. They came and acquired us for $1.7 billion. Yeah, the board didn't think we were going to make any money. That's it. That's all I got to say. In closing, positioning, deeply misunderstood. It's a good idea to think about it. And if you're going to do positioning, I recommend that you do it deliberately instead of just falling into whatever default positioning you have. Secondly, if we're going to go fix it, you're going to have to use a methodology. And I got one, but at least use something and don't just kind of eyeball this stuff. This is me, and where you can find me. I'm going to attempt to stop the share on this like this. Yeah. And then we're going to go into questions.
All right. Thanks very much, April. That was amazing. Now, if you have questions, please drop them into the YouTube chat. You can find that to the right of the YouTube screen if you're looking for that. And I see we have a question that has come in already from Flavio. How would you position? Actually, I can put that up on the screen. That's right. So how would you position your product tightly for a company that is only just launching? For example, a startup that only has 1 or 2 customers. So I guess you're maybe not quite there yet in terms of how you think about the product.
Yeah. So this is kind of an obvious question, right? Because you've got this starting point in my methodology is, what would customers do if you didn't exist? Well, if you're just starting out, you have no customers or maybe very few customers, maybe you don't know the answer to that question quite yet. And so here's kind of how I think about this. When you're building a product, typically you've built the product with a positioning thesis in mind. Most products are built like this. So let's say you're using lean startup methodology. You've interviewed a bunch of potential customers. You've built your thing based on that feedback. You don't have any paying customers yet, but you're about to launch this thing, or maybe you got 1 or 2 beta customers. And so what you've got is a positioning thesis. The thesis says, we assume this is who we're going to compete with. We think this is what our differentiators are. Therefore, our value is this. Therefore, the people that are going to love us are these folks. And therefore, this is the market we're going to go dominate. But you launch it into market and you don't know. And in fact, my experience tells me quite often we're wrong. Not completely wrong, but there's bits and pieces of our assumptions that were incorrect. And we just don't know until we get it launched and we get it into market. So my recommendation in that situation is you should know what your positioning thesis is. And ideally, you've documented it so that you're checking in on it to see, are we validating the thesis or not? But the positioning itself, like I would actually launch it with positioning that's kind of loose. And because you don't exactly know where to tighten it up yet. And so if you launch it with the assumption that this positioning is probably going to change, you want to keep it loose. So here's my example. It's a cheesy analogy, it was the only one I got. So it's like, I invented a fishing net. And my thesis is this is a great net for catching tuna. It's amazing for tuna. So I build this thing, world's greatest tuna net. Now, I could launch it as the tuna net, and then the tuna fisherman will buy it, and maybe it works, and maybe it doesn't, right? Or I could launch it and say, you know what? It's a net for fish, big fish, all kinds of big fish. I don't know what kind of fish, like all kinds of big fish. And then I hustle around and I get a first wave of fishermen to try it out. And then let's just see what we pull up. And maybe it turns out the thing is amazing for grouper and not tuna at all. But once I understand that, then I can say, it's actually a grouper fish net. And then I can tighten up around that and go sell the heck out of it to the grouper fishermen. So my recommendation on this is at the beginning, your positioning is not going to be what gets you that first wave of customers anyways. You're going to get that through networking and begging and pleading and, working who you know to get a first wave of customers in. Once you've validated your thesis, or at least validated some kind of thesis, and you start to see the patterns of who loves my stuff and why, then I can tighten the positioning up. But before that, it's okay for the positioning to be kind of loose.
Cool. Katrina, there's a whole lot of questions in there. How about you pick one? What question do you like the look of?
Yes, I was thinking, I quite like this one from Ben, what's the most common mistake you see when you help people who are positioning their product the first time? So I guess that's
So there's a bunch. So I can give you the first couple most common. So the most common mistake I see is people not thinking about competitive alternatives properly. Like they're thinking about competitors. And so if you look at people inside your company, if I go ask sales, who do we compete with? They will list the name of the competing company that we last lost a deal to. They'll say Oracle. We compete with Oracle. We lost a deal last week to Oracle. But if I go to product management, I go to the product management side and they'll say, oh my God, are you kidding? There's a list of 395 competitors. Here they are, every single one. And so the reality is somewhere in the middle. So the way positioning works is positioning, I don't have to worry about positioning against competitors that my customers don't consider. So they might be a horizon competitor. Maybe they're going to pop up as an actual competitor for me next year. But just because I can Google them, if my customer doesn't know them, if they never land on a short list, I don't have to worry about positioning against them. So usually the product managers have too many competitors listed. And really what we want to get to is who actually lands on a short list with us, because we got to compete with them and position against them. But I don't have to position against three guys in the basement that none of my competitor doesn't even know who they are. And then the other thing is status quo. So most of the time, both groups will just ignore status quo completely. And they'll just say, oh, well, we lost to no decision, when in fact you lost to a spreadsheet. If you're losing in B2B, we typically lose 30 to 40% of our deals to no decision, which means the spreadsheet beat us. So we need to consider that in our positioning and make sure that we're strongly positioned against, why not just use a spreadsheet? Because if we don't, then we're going to continue to lose this good chunk of deals to that. So that's the number one mistake I see people make, is they're not thinking about the full competitive set from the point of view of a customer, like what is actually an alternative to using your stuff. And sometimes that stuff looks nothing like yours. That's the first one. The second one is value. Like most folks are positioning around features. They're highlighting features. They're talking about features on their website, but they never actually translate those features into, why does this feature matter for a customer? And so what's the value of these features? We can't have 5,000 points of value. We want to get that down to 2 or 3 value themes. So ideally what we've got is positioning that says, look, here's 3 big reasons to pick us. And underneath each of those value statements, there's, these are the features that actually enable that value. Concept of value is actually really hard. And for most of the companies that I work with as a consultant, this value step is the hard step, in my opinion.
All right. Another question here. This one's kind of near and dear to my heart, being in previously in B2B. So this is from Penny, and it says, it sounds to me like positioning should focus on your offering right now.
Yeah.
Maybe your MVP, as opposed to your long-term vision. And I know that's something, having been through your book, I know you talk about the difference between sort of, positioning your product to your customers versus your investors, and maybe elaborate a little bit around that.
Yeah. So, and this is a big thing conceptually to understand. So you have the long-term vision of your company and the strategy for how you're going to get there. And, but positioning, the goal of positioning and the job of positioning is to craft the best possible story to help marketing and sales maximize revenue right now, because I can only sell what's on the truck right now. So sometimes we'll bring in a little bit of a flavor of the vision because customers think it's cool. But at the end of the day, I can't sell the vision. If I sell too much on the vision, customers will be like, well, that vision sounds amazing. It sounds great. Come back to me in 2 years when you can actually do it. Whereas if I'm pitching to investors, it's all about the vision. Like my investor pitch should look very different. My investor pitch is all about in 10 years, we're going to have this, we're going to have that. Oh my gosh, there's all this disruption. Look at these trends. Things are moving. Here's why we're a great investment and why we're going to be worth $1 billion in 10 years. But in marketing and sales, I can't sell that. One, because we don't do it today. Two, it might be scary as heck to customers because they're not ready for that vision. There's a reason it's 10 years out. And three, I run the risk is, even if they love it, if I can't deliver on it, then I'm giving them a reason to delay buying. So at every step in my strategy, I've got to be able to express the value of what I'm doing right now. And that's what positioning is good for. So a lot of companies come to me and they've just raised a round of financing, and I get this really common. So they've just raised a round of financing and they've got this great pitch that's just amazing with investors, and they use that. They raised $50 million and this pitch is amazing. And then they try to take that same pitch and use it for customers, and customers are like, I don't have a clue what you're talking about. And it just doesn't sell. And I think your investor pitch and your sales pitch have to be very different. Positioning is very rooted in why are we different and better than the alternative ways of solving this problem right now? Because you're going to give me your money right now, so I got to give you some value right now. And that's all a customer cares about.
Yes, that very much resonates as someone who's got the scars of salespeople selling off the roadmap. So yes.
Yeah, selling off the roadmap. Not good.
Fun times.
Yeah, not good.
Katrina, what question's doing it for you now?
Well, I'm going to ask one from Annie Lewis, because it was something I was thinking about as well. So have you used customer research to help find the customer fit positioning, or just test it in market?
Yeah, so yes. And so here's how this works in practicality. So when I'll give you a couple examples of this. So when I started out on this path, I thought, well, obviously we're going to go to customers and we're going to research what customers are doing. And even if I were to take that first step, right? If we didn't exist, what would you do? That sounds like a thing. I just go to my customers, I survey them, and I ask them that question. That's how I'm going to answer that question, right? Nah, not really. So here's where you can do it, but you got to be careful. So the first time I tried to do this, I'm working at this company. We got like 200 customers. I run this survey and I ask them exactly that question. If we didn't exist, what would you do? And I get these answers and I don't see any pattern. It's garbage. It's just like everybody's saying all kinds of things. And a bunch of stuff. I'm like, what? How could you think we compete with that? But I don't know. And so I'm looking at this data and I'm in my cube and I'm looking at this data and I got a face like this. My CEO walks by and he's like, what you looking at? And I'm like, I ran this thing to see who people think we compete with. And I got this bunch of garbage answers and I don't know what to make of it. And the guy looks at it, he squints and he goes, oh, who said that? He points at one of the answers, like, who said that? And so I pull out the spreadsheet and I'm like, Bank of Montreal. And he goes, oh, Bank of Montreal. He goes, you don't understand. Bank of Montreal is a terrible fit customer. Like, they use us in this weird way. We would never sell to them again. Like, I wish they would churn. Like if we're going to do positioning, April, do not count them. They don't count. They're weird. And then he's like, let me see who else answered. So he goes down the list and he crosses out like 5 or 6 or 10 of them. And says, oh, these ones, they have, they were the first customer we ever sold. They're weird. Don't take them out. But these guys, yeah, they use, weird use case. Never going to do it again. Take them out. So we take a whole bunch out. And then we run the chart again. Now I see the pattern. So not all customers are created equal. What you're trying to do in positioning is I'm trying to position myself such that I am attracting a pipeline full of very, very good fit customers. So if I'm trying to do that, I actually need to be able to separate wheat from chaff here. So how I used to do it after that is I would run a net promoter score or some other measure of customer happiness. And I would get a list of customers that are super happy. And then I would take that list to my head of sales and I'd say, who's good here? And head of sales would look down this list, and if anybody was weird or doing something weird, they'd be like, no, so just because they're happy doesn't mean they're a good fit. Take them off. And then I take it to head of customer success, and I'd be like, who's good here? And customer success knows all the ones that are like weird as well. Or no, take those off, take those off. Then I got a list of happy customers, look like a good fit customer. We'd be happy if we had a pipeline full of folks that look just like this. Then I could interview them. And the interview would be a bit like a jobs to be done interview. Like you could get them on the phone and say, all right, let's go all the way back to before you had us. What were you doing before? This is going to get me an idea of status quo. So what were you doing before we did the deal with you? Like, how did you solve this problem? And then what was the trigger event that made you wake up in the morning and say, we can't keep doing it that way. We've got to do it another way. And then once you did have that trigger event, you decided you were going to do something else. How did you make a short list? What were your criteria? Who ended up on the short list? And hey, you picked us. Why pick us? And importantly, why not the other folks? So I would do that stuff. Now, all that said, if you're B2B and you have a sales team, your sales team knows the answers to these questions, because they know what status quo is in the account. They know who else they're battling against on a short list. They don't know whether the customer is good fit or bad fit. So I might need to do some stuff there. But in the work I do with customers now, if it's B2B and there's direct selling happening, I can suck a lot of that information out from the salespeople. I just need a way to structure it. And of course, they're not going to say, if I say who's the competitor, they're not going to think of status quo unless I ask them that specifically. So there is a big role to play in customer research in this. And when I was a VP marketing, I used to spend a lot of time sitting in and listening on sales calls, and then a lot of time interviewing good fit, happy customers. But you can do it if you're B2B and you have salespeople involved in the deal. You can do it by just squeezing the information out of your sales reps to a certain extent. If you have a zero-touch sales model or you're B2C and nobody talks to a person, then you've got no other choice. You have to go and get it because you won't know the answer to these questions otherwise.
And I guess there's a little bit of a segue question there, and interesting what you're talking about customers that are almost misusing your product and whether or not that's kind of a signal or a noise. There's a question from Lorraine that kind of aligns with that a little bit. She was asking, is there ever a reason to have two similar products, or maybe even the same product, positioned differently in different markets?
Yeah, so I've worked in many companies where we had that temptation. Like, it was possible for us to sell the same product to two completely different buyers, different value propositions, different competitors, different everything. The problem with that is it doesn't work long term, because if the competitors are different, the differentiators are different, the value props are different, the product roadmaps are going to diverge. So eventually this becomes two separate products. So generally you may have a moment in time where you have that, but you can't sustain it because, again, the differentiators are different, value props are different. So the roadmap's going to look different. What they want is two different things. And so generally, if we're at a startup and we're in this situation where it's like, I got these two, generally what I got to do is I got to choose which one am I going to chase? Because I can't chase both. So I got to chase one. Now, sometimes what we have is really different segments that we're serving with the same product, but the value propositions are the same. And that's okay. So, people will sometimes think that, if I'm selling to banks and retailers, my gosh, I'm going to have two completely different value propositions because they're in different industries and different whatever. And no, at one point I worked at a company and we did data backup and recovery stuff. And it didn't matter whether you were retail or banking or whatever you were, value propositions were the same. It was a horizontal positioning. So it was fine. We could service all kinds of customers. What mattered was how much data did you have? How much availability did that data need? What was the size of your IT budget? How big was your IT team? What kind of platforms were you using? That we were segmenting on that and not actually industry or size of business or anything else. Because the use case was the same, but it was horizontal. But yeah, sometimes you'll get this one where it's like, we could go do this for restaurants, or we could go do this for, marketing teams, and that both works. But it's like, trust me, the restaurants want something different than the marketing teams eventually. And so you'll have to either diverge it. In big companies, sometimes they'll just split that off, or they'll do it with modules, or it'll be the same core product, but you'll have different add-on modules. And I've been in situations where we've done that. But usually we end up having, the product's going to diverge. And so at some point, you're going to have to pick.
Approach with caution, in other words.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. I just had an epiphany on that. Like, yeah, definitely that idea of, oh, well, of course, why wouldn't you do that? But yeah, split roadmaps.
The problem is the next release, these guys come with one set of features they want. These guys come with another set of features, and it's like,
yeah.
you end up with a 9-headed monster of a product that doesn't make anybody happy.